Hello everyone. This lesson assumes that this is your very first chess lesson and you're going to learn how to set up the board, captures, trades, en passant, castling, and more. So let's start with the starting position. The board you see in front of you is how the pieces are set up. And on the bottom right is the rook, the knight, the bishop, the king, the queen, and the bishop, knight, and rook again. And on the second rank are the pawns. When you set up the board, place the board in front of you and make sure that there is a white square on the bottom right. And if you notice, there will be a white square on the right side for the black side as well. The other major point is to place the queen on the white square here and the king next to it. And if you notice, the black queen is opposite the white queen, as is the king. The reason a white square is placed on the bottom right is so that later, if you want to notate your games, you'll be able to do so that other people can read it. There's an international standard for doing this, and if you notice, this board has 1, 2, 3, 4 on the side here, and an A, B, C over to H here. And that means that each square has a letter and number designated to it, so that all the squares are able to be marked. So this square here on the left would be the A1 square. So if I move the knight here, that would be the F3 square. Here's the F file, and on the third rank, so this would be knight to F3. White moves first, and then black, and then white again. I think it's important to obey the touch rule in chess, and that means that if you touch a piece, you move it. And also not to make any takebacks. Don't ask your opponent to take the last move back. So now let's see how each of the chess pieces move. Okay, starting with the king, notice that the king can move to one square in any direction. He can move to any of the squares that the arrows are pointing to right next to him, horizontally, vertically, diagonally. And here's one of the rules of chess. The black king cannot enter any of those squares that the arrows are pointing to. The kings cannot move next to each other, in other words. Next we have the queen. She's the most powerful piece on the board. Notice that she can move in any direction, horizontally, vertically, and diagonally, just like the king. But she can move to any number of squares on each turn, but only one square. Next we have the rook, the second most powerful piece on the board next to the queen. It can move to any number of squares on each turn, both horizontally and vertically. Next are the bishops, and they can only move diagonally. And if you notice, there is a bishop on a white square, a light square, and a dark square, and they are restricted to only those colored squares. Next are the knights. They are the only piece that can jump over any other piece. And if you notice, they can move to 8 squares, given the opportunity if they are, near the center, which makes them very tricky pieces. Last but definitely not least are the pawns. The pawns can move 1 or 2 squares forward. They can only move 2 squares forward from the starting position. After that, they can only move 1 square forward, although they do capture diagonally. So let's look at how the pieces capture at checks, and another special pawn move called en passant, and at castling. Okay, let's look at how each piece attacks and captures. Let's say white plays pawn to e4, and knight plays to f6, and now you see that the knight is attacking this pawn. If white doesn't see this and makes a move which doesn't defend the pawn or push the knight away, then black would simply be free to capture the pawn. If you're playing a much better opponent, then this is a pretty significant advantage. If you're playing another beginner, well, you'll probably have a chance to win your own pawn back later. But when you're up material, you actually have more ability to attack and maybe capture even more material because your opponent has fewer pieces with which to defend with. And then also, in the end game, or if a pawn can go all the way to the end, which we'll be discussing later, it can become a queen. You can promote to any piece that you want. So your strategy when you're up material is to try and trade as many pieces as you can, and then you'll be left with a pawn, 2 pawns against 1. Maybe one of those pawns can become a queen. So the moral of the story is always look and see what your opponent's last move was and see if it's attacking something, and make sure you don't lose any undefended. pieces or pawns. Okay, now let's look at how the queen attacks and captures. So let's just set up a position here. And let's say pawn to d4, pawn to d5. We're just going to move some pieces out. And we'll be explaining, in the strategy section, we'll be explaining more about how to bring your pieces out effectively. But for now, we're just trying to set up the position so we can see how the queen attacks and captures. So let's just get to the position. Okay. Black just played the pawn here to b6, and when the king is attacked, that's what a check is. A check is when the king is attacked, and when the king is attacked, the rules say the king has to either move, you have to block the check, try to maybe if you can capture the attacker, but the king cannot remain in check. If the king cannot get out of check, well, that's what checkmate is. So in this position, we see that the bishop is undefended, and we do have a check. So the queen can slide here and check the king. Well, whatever black does, the king can. If the king runs, the queen can capture the bishop. If the bishop comes here, for instance, to attack the queen can still capture the bishop. Now, if the knight, let's say the knight comes here, well, now this pawn can capture the knight instead. And we win a piece anyway. This is a common way that the queens win material, either a pawn or a piece, through a double attack by checking the king and then picking off the undefended piece or pawn. Now let's look at how the rook attacks and captures. The rooks are our horizontal and vertical weapons. So let's just set up a position here. All right, we're just going to bring some pieces out and get to our critical position. Okay, notice that both rooks here are undefended, and black just brought the pawn here to defend, add support to this pawn, because it was being attacked 2 times. Like if I back up here, you'll see that it's being attacked by the knight, and it's being attacked by the pawn. So 2 against 1, you win material. So it added a pawn, a defender, but not realizing that white has what I call the power of first strike. Basically, whose turn it is to move in chess is critical. It's having the tempo. So when you have the tempo, it usually means that you can gain something, either a strategical goal or you can win material. So white can simply take this pawn, and if black recaptures, well, then the rook is free to grab this rook. Now, if we set it up a little bit more complicated, let's say this pawn, let's say we make another move, and then black does this. Because this rook is undefended, we're still free to do something pretty tricky here. We can take this pawn, and let's say black recaptures this way, and this capture happens fairly often in chess. The knight can grab this pawn, and the pawn captures, and the rook again is free to capture the undefended rook. The knights are worth 3 points, and the rooks are worth 5, so it was a good trade. Next are the bishops, our diagonal fighters. The bishop pair can cover every square on the board. One covers the light squares and the other the dark squares. So let's set up a position here. All right, we're just going to develop our pieces. Like I said, we'll talk more about how to develop the pieces in the strategic section in the strategy video. All right, so we have our position here. Notice that the bishop is bearing down on this rook. For beginners, this isn't obvious, but it's called an X-ray. It's one of the ways of describing it in chess. So if this knight were to move, then the bishop would be free to capture this rook. And mistakes are made in chess. It's a game of errors. So let's say the knight captures the pawn, and then the bishop is free to capture the rook. So this is one way that, anyway, bishops attack on the diagonal, and they capture on the diagonal. As mentioned earlier, pawns capture diagonally. And let's just set up a quick position here. We bring the pieces out. Okay, let's back up. All right, so let's say black captures. Black can capture this way. White can capture this way. Either the white can capture this pawn. But in this scenario, let's look at black captures this pawn. But now white launches one of the deadly tactics in chess. It's called a fork, or a double attack, and the pawn moves forward, and it can sacrifice itself. But again, pawns are worth 1 point, and bishops and knights are worth 3. So this would be a very nice trade. So if black decides to capture the pawn, then white could capture the bishop, and white comes out ahead. Okay, bringing up the rear is the king, who generally doesn't participate in the battle until later in the game when there are fewer pieces and less chance of being checked or checkmated. So let's say, black makes a move, and now the king can also slide up and double attack the knight and the bishop. So he'd be free to capture one of the pieces on the next move. I don't think they can save each other. No, he could check him, but then he'd be free to capture the bishop. Kings capture in any direction, diagonally, horizontally, or vertically. Now let's turn to the pawns again. As was mentioned earlier, if you manage to win a pawn earlier in the game and are able to hold on to that advantage, when you reach the end game, after all the pieces are traded off, you could end up with 2 pawns against 1. And when a pawn reaches the last rank on the opponent's side of the board, it can promote itself to royalty. It can become a queen or a bishop or a rook. Generally, people promote to queens, but there are scenarios where it's better to promote to a lower rank piece. So we see 2 against 1 here, and there is nothing that black can do to stop the pawn from becoming a queen. And with the queen and king, you can easily checkmate the black king. There is another pawn maneuver you need to learn about, and it's called en passant from the French with my American pronunciation, and it roughly means in passing. Chess is an international game, and words are used from various languages, including German and Italian. And the move is, if your pawn reaches the 5th rank here, and because the pawns can move 1 or 2 squares from their starting position, well, if the pawn hasn't moved 2 squares, and let's say this pawn moves 2 squares forward, white can actually capture this pawn on the left diagonally this way. And it's the only time it can happen is in that position from the 5th rank, and if the other pawn hasn't moved forward. It can happen from either side if the black pawn marches all the way to its 5th rank, and white does the same thing. And it captures it in passing. One of the most important moves in chess is called castling, and it takes place after the bishop and the knight have left the back rank. This unites the king and the rook. And the move is done. It's 1 move, and the king moves 2 squares over, and then the rook slides over to the other side of the king. And black can also do the same on either the king side of the board or the queen side of the board. This move is made to get the king away from the center where all the action and danger lies. So it's a move that takes place in most games played, and one you should know about and also do. Now proceed to the lesson on chess tactics.